All right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Buried Bible Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, the lesser of these, Keagan Walz, with the scholar, Dr. Mark Chavalas.
Hey, good to be here, and next time call me when you're going to wear white.
Hey, we look good on the backdrops.
I suppose.
We'll match next time once we get our bulk order of Buried Bible Podcast polos, right? I'll get you a dad gang hat too.
I can't wait. Yeah,
we can each sport one of these,
as long as it says LA on it.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, been a little while. You're back in the studio since the last time we talked, and we started Genesis. It feels like we started Genesis quite a while ago, but we will do our best to pick it up where we left off. So, maybe we just start out by a little bit going back over what we just talked about. If you haven't already watched the last episode, go ahead and do that. We talked through Genesis 1 verses 1 and 2, and then our goal is to move on. It seems like you remember that.
To another verse, huh?
Vividly. So, hopefully we'll move into 3. But why don't you just quick 30-second, 1 minute synopsis on your take of Genesis, what's happening, what's the main purpose, and then we'll move into verse 3.
Well, I think, again, in the context of the ancient Near East, the writer there, let's call him Moses, is attempting to show that the God of Israel is superior to the nations and their idea of the conceptual of heavenly reality, the gods together. And so the writer is showing that this God is in complete command and control of everything that exists, and that he is orderly and functional and doesn't have to fight with anyone else when he's creating his world. And so it's very calm and collected, and every part of creation is manipulated by him. When I use that term, I mean in the purest sense, that he's controlling it, including things that were considered to be divine. And I'm anticipating what's going to be happening in verses, 14 and 15 about the stars and the sun and the moon are in complete control and submissive to him. Of course, they're submissive because they're simply props. They're inanimate props rather than anything else. And so somebody reading this who was, let's say, raised in a polytheistic tradition, they would basically have their mental head gasket would be blown off right now. Like, wait a minute, this is the reverse of everything I've ever learned. And that's precisely what the point is. Are we doing this in any particular sequential order? Well, perhaps there might be, but I don't think it's the primary purpose. And so if you're looking for... So in other words, I think the goal of Genesis 1 is to talk about how everything came into existence, but more important than that, it's not so much how and when it happened, but who did it and his character, which is shown by his complete and absolute power and his order and how he makes everything function in the way that it's to his own design.
Awesome. So yeah. So again, looking at it more of the function, identity, you had non-order, you had chaos, and then he's creating order, as opposed to a little bit more of the scientific, here's the actual form and layout of how things were created. So that would be a little bit of your perspective.
And you think about it, people didn't ask those scientific questions until we were scientifically oriented. Funny thing about that. In other words, we didn't have questions about, I wonder about the nature of the universe and how it was constructed and in terms of order and time span and all of that really weren't particular questions until we became oriented that way in, let's say, about the 17th and 18th centuries. In the same way, and maybe I've already brought this up before in a previous lecture, but I can't remember. But in terms of, let's say, our modern culture, we really didn't start looking at how women played a role in the historical record until we were interested in that issue on a social level. And so when do we start looking at women in antiquity? Late 60s, early 70s in America. And of course, that's when the social revolution is occurring. And so we're now going backwards, going into an environment trying to extract information from a source which may not have been there for the express purpose of answering the questions that we have. It doesn't mean we can't ask the questions. It just means that we're going to have a little harder time answering them. And so if my question is about the scientific veracity of Genesis 1, first of all, I'm not qualified to respond on it. I don't have that expertise. And even if I did, I would say I'm not convinced that the writer of Genesis 1 is trying to answer the question that I'm asking. And I think that becomes very frustrating, especially in the evangelical world.
Yeah. And so to my mind, how I would put that is the focus of how we read things, we place a bunch of emphasis on the material objects as opposed to the substance, form, and the function of the objects. So we're placing it on, okay, we actually care about the material object, and it's talking about its function and identity within the cosmos.
And and the fact that God is in control. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of this. That's not what the other ancients saw. And so this is actually remarkably revolutionary document, in my opinion.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm sure later we'll probably talk about some of those other creation accounts and see the differences between Yahweh and all of these other little G's, as they say. So we'll pick up. So I'll read. So we'll look at verses 3 and 4. Hopefully we get to 5. I doubt we get to 6, just because you're long-winded and I might have some questions. So verses 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning, the first day.
Man, that's really cool. I'm looking at it as if I'd never read it before, but you also have to realize this is something that people are listening to in antiquity. Okay, people don't have books. A colleague of mine, Gary Rensburg, just recently came out with a book called "How the Bible Is Written," and you're thinking, "What is he talking about? Is written? It wasn't. It was written a long time ago." And what he's saying is, he's talking about literary style, and this is another thing that people, I think, also in the evangelical world, are a little nervous about. Is that one of the purposes of the Bible, when God wants to draw near to us, he's going to be doing it in a way that would be interesting to us, and should I say also even entertaining. And so the literary value of Genesis 1 is rather amazing. Even though it's narrative, it's got beautiful type of poetic cadence, and it's being done in a way that's not seen anywhere else in biblical Hebrew, and it's not normative for us either. So it's using some sort of strange literary style. And when you read it, you already notice the cadence. And by the way, we're going to get further along only because I kind of lump verse 3 and the rest of the chapter down to about, in the 20s together, because we've got different occurrences. And so, at the end of 5, and there was evening and there was morning one day. And of course, why does it start with evening? Because that's the Jewish day. Begins in the evening, not in the morning. And so it's quite normative. But that phrase, of course, is going to be used, periodically, verse 8, what is it? I wasn't looking at, but verse 13, and I'm probably missing one or two, but the point is, and then occasionally it'll give you a slight variation in it, which the ear is going to hear, oh, that was a little different. And it sort of perk you up. Oh, I better be listening more carefully. And then it talks about, things being good. And of course, people, I think it's really interesting in verse 3 that nothing happens until God speaks it. Okay, God has to speak for things to exist. And so I must be, and by the way, this is the ancient Near Eastern mindset. I can be deliberative and I can think, but until I actually speak, even look at it from a negative standpoint. I know this is an analogy, but if I'm angry, it's now, of course, Jesus tells us if you're angry in your heart, that's bad. But if I actually speak the anger, I can't take it back. And so that's very powerful. The word is powerful. I can bless and I can curse, and neither of them I can take back. And so the universe isn't going to start until God speaks it. Why do we not start with God speaking before? It's probably more dramatic this way for the Hebrew mindset. I don't know. And where is light before this? Does light not exist? That's a question. That's a really good question, but it's quite irrelevant. The reader's not, the writer's not going to tell us. And does verse 3 happen after verse 2? Well, I sort of guess so, but I don't know where verse 2 fits in this formless and deep. And the rabbis in antiquity, and I might have brought this up before, but I'll say it again, maybe in a different way. Some of them, commentators, argued that God's more like an architect, and he's got his raw materials, and they're just sitting here, and now he's getting started. And oh yeah, when you're working, you got to have light, and so let's start with the light. How does this work scientifically? I'm the last person to ask. And frankly, I think if you ask the scientists, they'd probably be the last person to ask too, because we just don't know. And I'm okay with I don't know, and we're going to hear that a lot, not just today, by the way. And the fact that it's good in verse 4, the term good is kind of like the term good in English, tov. This pizza tastes good. You're a really good boy. If you would talk to our kids or grandkids, obviously those are two different terms and we mean something different about them. And so what does it mean here? I kind of doubt it is talking about something that's moral, because how inanimate object can't really be moral. So I'm going to guess it's probably aesthetically pleasing. God's looking at it and say, I like this. I'm pleased with what I've done. And can God act that way? Whatever you think about it, whatever emotional characteristics that we have that are sort of generic, we got them from God. I like when people think, well, God's a jealous God. That's bad. Actually, the word in Hebrew for zealous is talking about jealous is actually talking about zealous. In other words, he's jealous for taking care of you and protecting you, not jealous in the way that we think about, I'm jealous, which would be, I don't like when you talk to somebody else. It's an irrational attachment that I have. Well, God doesn't have that. So anyway, so why are we being told this? Because it's orderly. And think about it. God, verse 5, God, okay, and separate the light from the darkness. What's the darkness? Well, we know what it is. You look up in the sky, you can see it. So we're being told that there's light and darkness. And what's it like in the heavenly realms? Well, it's not physical there, so it's sort of hard to imagine exactly what it is. God has his heavenly court. Why aren't we being told here about that? We didn't need to know. I guess we have to wait till Deuteronomy 32 and other places to find out about, God's heavenly court. We get snippets of it here and there, but we don't get it here. And so if your question is, what about all the other things? What about Satan? What about, the angels that fell and all that other stuff? And said, I'm trying to look in between the lines, and I don't see it yet. So I guess I don't need to worry about it. And so the purpose is to show us order. God speaks things into existence. And I don't remember how much we said about 2, but 2 is very pregnant with ancient Near Eastern, background. The deep there is the deep water, which is also, it's an animate object in Mesopotamia. And so Tiamat, who's the mother of all creation. So there's no doubt about that the writer knows exactly what he's alluding to, and the listeners will know that too. Okay, in the same way that if you watch the Super Bowl and you're seeing at halftime, some guy comes out in a funny suit, with a hat and an American flag all over him. You say, oh, that's Uncle Sam. Well, can you imagine somebody in 3025 being asked that? Well, why is that guy dressed up in such a funny outfit? Well, anybody who's breathing in the 21st century knows exactly what, who he's representing, but here, there are little clues here and there about what they're representing. And of course, my goal is to try and figure what those are 3,000 years later. Not always easy to do. So there's light and there's darkness. Is there any spiritual dimension to all this? Perhaps, but I don't see it from a mundane standpoint. I don't see it yet. Then it says one day. What's the word for day in Hebrew? Pretty generic. It's kind of like the word day in English. It can talk about a 24-hour span. It can talk about a 12-hour span. In other words, you think about it. When do you want to meet? Today. Like during the day or at night. So in other words, I've just used the term in a slightly different mode. I'm talking about light time when I talk about daytime, rather than night. Or I might be, an old codger and say, hey, in my day, the baseball players were a lot better than they are today because what was my day? Well, back in the old days, So
then what would you say to the emphasis of, but it seems to be framing it in here by saying there was evening and there was night the first day, and then all of them are subsequently that way. Because that would be the biggest pushback. It has to be 7 literal days. And if it wasn't, then why even include this? Because it's not just saying the day, it's saying there's evening and there's morning, giving it a 24-hour time period, seemingly by book stamping it that way, the first day, the second day,
I'm not opposed to that, but I'm also not tied to it at all. In other words, I'm going to keep the jury out because I know that if the primary goal is to show God's order and function and complete control, then I'm going to look at this and maybe we can start summarizing the whole thing together. Think about each day. Day 1 and day 4 are connected because day 1, 2, and 3 are inanimate. The inanimate objects are being made and they're being placed in strategic places. And day 4, 5, and 6, the animate objects are now being placed in those strategic places. Okay, is that how things were actually done? How would any of us know that? And scientifically, you might say, well, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Well, who asked us? I guess my answer is, this is not a scientific treatise on how the universe was built. But I think that people like to put it in that context. It makes us feel good if we look at it that way, I suppose. And so I'm asking the question is, I'm not sure the ancient Near Eastern mindset thinks the same way we do about how to look at Genesis 1. And so I'm leaving it open because of that, which of course is going to cause uncertainty. And people don't, especially when you're talking about people's theological ducks, they don't like uncertainty. This isn't the best podcast for certainty.
There you go.
Guess,
if you want certainty, I guess don't.
Not a theologian. And by the way, if I was a theologian, I would hope I'd be talking the same way. But maybe that's why I'm not a theologian. Because really, if you think about it, do you have any questions before I move on?
No, you do it.
Okay, so, and I'm looking at particular things rather than trying to summarize the whole thing, because you get to 6, and then of course you got something that blows your mind. It talks about an expanse. What's an expanse? It's actually a better word for it is dome, and in other contexts is talking about a hard covered shell-like thing. You're thinking, where's that out there? I haven't seen it. We haven't found it either. And so what's he talking about? Well, in the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia, the universe, when I say the universe, I mean everything everything that exists, all matter, is in three parts. You've got the upper part, which are the heavens, which is, by the way, divided in a couple of different parts. And then you've got the earth, and then you've got the under the earth, which, by the way, is the deep. It's also where death is in the ancient Near East. And so we have texts actually talking about this. I mean, if you want to look this up, go get Vladimir Horowitz's Mesopotamian Cosmology, and he'll tell you the whole story. And then he'll and in many respects, the Israelite mindset has not changed, and God's goal here is not to try to tell them, oh, by the way, you got that part all wrong. No, the primary goal is to show them that God, their God, is the only God, and he's in complete control of everything. It's not to help them understand everything else that is maybe incorrect. And so so everything is being described in a framework that is understandable to them. And you think about it, it's still there in the New Testament. Think about Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, when he's talking in autobiographical terms, but in the third person. I know a man, and I don't know whether he was, in the body or out of the body, but he was caught up into the third heaven. The third heaven is the throne of God. The second heaven is the stars, and etc. And then the next heaven is the atmosphere that we know of. In other words, they understand these things, but they see also. But then you read in Philippians 2 when it talks about Jesus being given the title indeed to being Kurios, Lord, and they talk about all existence. It talks about the heavens, the earth, and the other under the earth, and the same thing is mentioned just before the laws are given at Sinai. It talks about the three-part universe. In other words, when these laws are being given, it's everything everywhere is going to understand this. And when Paul talks about principalities and powers, he's got the same understanding of existence. Is it incorrect? Who am I to say it's incorrect? It's not the way that we think of things. That's for sure. We think of things in our very secular, naturalistic orientation. And so we are trying to take that orientation and superimpose it upon a text that has no interest in that. And it causes problems. It causes people to try to force the Bible into a position that is ultimately untenable, in my opinion. They're trying to make it into something that, and to project it into a scientific framework. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying it just has a different purpose. So you have this expanse thing, and of course my colleague John Walton has written a couple books on this, on Israelite cosmology, and I don't agree with everything he says, but of course if we're both breathing, I suppose that would be the case. But he tries to look at this in a much more detailed way than what we're doing right here, and he wrote a whole book on it. And so you've got this expanse in the midst of the waters. What waters? Oh, the waters up there in 2. And of course, everyone knows the Mesopotamian story about the fact that the waters, that matter begins. In other words, everything starts with matter, and the waters start commingling, and at their commingling, animate happens. In other words, consciousness comes out of the commingle of waters. How does that work? I don't know. Doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me. And then from them, the gods ultimately come out of it. And then what do? They beat each other's brains out in Mesopotamia. That's their so-called creation epic. And I think in many respects, the writer here is trying to respond to that by saying, I know how you were raised. I look at Abraham. We think of Abraham as this, great man of faith, and I'm not saying he wasn't, but when God picks him, it's almost as if God, from our standpoint, it looks like this. God's looking around and says, all right, I'm going to close my eyes and I'm going to pick him. Now God obviously is much wiser than that, and he's not random. It might look random to us. So why did he pick Abraham? I don't know why he picked Abraham, but there was nothing about Abraham that he picked. He's a Mesopotamian minding his own business. He's thoroughly polytheistic. He's probably a moon worshiper because he's living in the city of Ur. And this God comes to him in Genesis 12. We'll get there eventually, I guess. But this God doesn't start by saying, "Hey, Abraham, I'm the only God. Stop worshiping all those other gods and worship me because I'm the right God." He doesn't say any of those things. He just says, "I got a great deal for you. I'm going to bless you, and from your loins will all the nations of the world be blessed." You're thinking, what? I don't even have any kids. He says, and we don't even have a dialogue there. There's no dialogue. Abraham says, so that's really cool. Who are you again? And Abraham doesn't seem to get it. And how long is it between Genesis 12? And he says, oh, by the way, for you to get this gift, you have to go to a far land, hundreds of far away. In fact, just go to the land I show you. Just start walking and I'll let you know when you get there. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And so it's like, this is really random. And so is Abraham a monotheist yet? My answer would be no. In fact, we probably have a lot better theology than he would, because we already see we'd been given privy to the end from the beginning, and Abraham, I don't even know how much he understood before he died, but the point is he's just an average Mesopotamian guy. And so the people who are listening to this, I think Moses is trying to present, and of course this is through God, but there's the divine element of Scripture and the human element are commingled together in a way that we cannot separate them at all. So each human personality comes out, but the overriding, factor is God. How God works through each of them seems to be different. I mean, God's infinitely diverse, and so why can't he do it any way he wants? And so the character of the writer, and maybe we'll talk about authorship one of these days, but not today, because I think that might be at the end of our show if we went too far with this. But he's meeting them where they're at, and who are they? These are late Bronze Age people who have pretty much just been introduced to monotheism, and it's like, yeah, this is kind of weird. Again, I don't know. I hesitate to use an analogy, and I won't use a Huck Finn analogy, but I will use an analogy. You think about it. Let's say God comes to you tomorrow and says, everything you ever learned about me was wrong, 100% wrong. We're starting over again at ground zero. You've got to be retrained. Now, of course, this doesn't seem realistic because you say, well, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say that happened. How long would it take? Probably about as long as I already started living. If I've been living for 70 plus years, it's probably going to take me that long to try to, to be retrained. And so here are these people trying to understand this, and God is meeting them where they're at with this information, with this order. I'm a God of order. And since this is to be listened to, it's really convenient. Is this a 24-hour day? Perhaps. The term day could mean a lot of different things. And in this format, maybe it's 12-hour days. I don't know. It's giving you that order. By the way, I'm saying that for the sake of argument, So he makes the expanse 7, separates these waters below the expanse from the waters above the expanse. Oh, by the way, that's the separation of heaven and earth, and then the waters underneath. And so it's talking about the 3-part universe, which everyone in the ancient Near East would understand. Are we going to argue that it's scientifically wrong when that wasn't the purpose? A lot of this, by the way, might be described as, dare I say, cosmic geography, which would be heavenly geography. What does that mean? I don't know. It seems to be different than earthly geography. Go look it up. and whatever this expanse is, it's like, well, you know what people will argue? Well, the expanse got blown apart during the flood. Well, sorry, I'm not exactly sure exactly how that works later on when the floodgates open up, because we're talking about the fountains of the deep and, the water coming from below and coming from above. But we're not privy to all that. So, so on the first day, God's making the structure. He's taking the pre-existing parts that are described in 2. And I said this before, is that we can surmise later on that God creates all of this out of nothing, but that's not the purpose of the writer, and it really isn't explicit in Genesis 1. I'm not saying I'm convinced God would create it out of nothing, but that's not the purpose of the text, in my opinion. So God calls the expanse heaven in verse 8. Okay, that's the dome. And is that above the dome? I can't tell. It was evening and it was morning, a second day. So there's already been 2 days, and he's basically taking the structures that he has, and now he's putting them and framing them in the way he wants them. And the days tell me it's ordered. Did it take God 24 hours to do each of these things? I don't know. I mean, I guess if it makes me feel good, I'll say, yeah, maybe it took him 24 hours to do this and 20. I mean, I suppose it could have taken God a millisecond to do it. If, he felt like it. Why does it have to take 24 hours? I don't know. It's orderly in structure, and it hears well for the reader. I think we really miss that, is that this is also going to be aesthetically pleasing to the ear listening to it. It's got order and cadence, and it's kind of like when you're singing an old hymn and the refrain comes along. Oh, good, the refrain's back. I know what that's going to say, and now I can relax and listen, and sing that. And now we're back to another stanza. We like things like that, even if you don't like hymns. I like them but I'm old. All right, then. Okay, we've already got 2 days. Then night, God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. So it was so. God called the dry land earth, eretz, and gathering of waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. So that, again, we have that good in verse 10. Why didn't we have it in a minute ago? We have it here because it hears it. You hear it well. Now finally, we start having, at the end of day 3, we start having vegetation in plants. In other words, they're being dumped in here. And I had said what day 1, 2, and 3, and so we actually have the dumping by the end of day 3 before day 4. Why is that? Because it's probably aesthetically pleasing to hear. I don't know what the reason is. There probably is a reason behind it. In fact, there's reason behind every word. And one goal is to try to figure it out. Sometimes it's literary. In other words, they'll say a word in Genesis 50 that was mentioned in Genesis 38, and the listener will supposed to remember, oh, I heard that weird word before, and so I'm supposed to connect this story in 38 with this story in 50. And by the way, I'm just making up numbers here, but the point is, we often forget about that. That's the literary nature of the Bible, which I'm just beginning to study, by the way. I've ignored it for 50 years. And I'm being confronted with it. And I'm not exactly a literary person, so it's hard to do.
So let's pause there. And can you explain, from the heavenly geography perspective, maybe some things we haven't talked about yet between the waters and then the dry land coming up, how they would have understood, or did we not miss anything?
I don't know. I think, here, of course, he's explaining the existing condition that any Israelite can now see. Is that all right? How did the seas get here? How did the earth get here? So in other words, now it's not as much cosmic here. It's talking about the actual physical place that we're living on. And of course, if we're wondering, how does the earth fit in the context of the entire universe? No, that's all you need to know is we're talking about your neck of the woods right now. This is the concern of the writer, is to tell us what's happening in our neck of the woods. Are there any other woods? And the fact that the woods are really, really big, infinitely bigger than we ever would have imagined, that's not the purpose of the writer. In fact, I would venture a guess that Moses himself would be entirely unaware of it. But divine inspiration means that God chose to have this written down to manifest his glory. And so we want to emphasize the power of God. That's what it says in Romans 1. The gospel is God's power. The Bible never talks about itself being inerrant or infallible. I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying that those are negative terms. It uses positive terms to talk about what God is and the power of the gospel. And it really wasn't, if you think about it, really wasn't until someone like Luther, and then a little bit later on with the Reformation, Renaissance Reformation and scientific revolution, when they began thinking about the Bible in what I would call negative terms, saying, there's no error. Again, I'm fine with that, except that it's just not the purpose of the text to be described that way. I mean, if you want to put it tongue in cheek, there are errors, but they're funny errors, errors of exaggeration. I think I mentioned this the first week or so, is that, in book of Judges, it says not a man was left, in the next verse a man was left. And so it's like everyone understands that this is exaggeration. And so if you're taking it hyper literally, then you can't anymore. So I don't know what else to say. It explains the dry land, and I'm also going to say, I don't know whether this is sequential. This is functional. We like it to be sequential because that's how we think. I like my story to go in order. And even if I brought this up before, I'll bring it up again. I remember in the 70s when I started watching a movie that had everything out of order, and it was, in other words, if it was like a semi-biographical movie, and they start with an important event in the person's life, and the next event is when they're a child, and then they go back to a point when they're old. You're thinking, this is ridiculous. Why are they going back and forth? That's not how the person lived. And of course, the goal was to have you affected by certain events in the order that the writer wanted you to be affected by them. And of course, the gospel writers did the same thing. You look at Mark. My mother and grandmother would have called the order of Mark's gospel as cattywampus. It looks to the reader as if Jesus is just all over the place, and he does this, he does that, he does this, and is it in sequential historical order? No, not in the least. It's in the order that Mark wants to present it to you. Luke tries to put order to it, in my opinion, but that's another story. So God has order here. Is it chronological order? I don't know. The jury's out. I put it this way. I would never say it's not, but I wouldn't be surprised if when we're in heaven, God says, well, of course it wasn't in chronological order. That wasn't my goal. And so I think to me, it's a point of humility. I'm not really sure what's going on here. And so I'm going to look at what other commentators say and address this and respect, well, that person probably really worked hard to get their ideas. Let me respect it and trying to figure it out and then move on. So what's more important about, let's say, verse 11 and following about the earth sprouting vegetation and plants, etc., is the order, is that it's not so much that all these things exist, it's the fact that there's a singular, heavenly, otherworldly, non-corporal entity that is controlling all of this by himself with nobody else's help. There's no God doing it. There's no impersonal fate that Mesopotamia has that's working through this. The gods of Mesopotamia, they're able to manipulate matter in their own neighborhood, but they can't manipulate the whole thing. In fact, when matter gets too overcoming for them, they're just as vulnerable as we are to a catastrophe. And so, but this, you can tell, this God is transcendent. This is a transcendent being that is in absolute and complete control of everything that's happening. And the writer wants to make sure that you understand it's in every aspect. It's the inanimate objects in day 1, 2, and 3. It's the animate objects which begin at the end of 3. But we have the plants, and of course they're dividing things up. You have plants, you have, and then when you have the animate, the creatures, the animal, it means something with a soul to it. That how do they divide them up? The sky, the earth, and then the sea. Again, just like the universe itself divided up into 3, the animate objects, the creatures, are divided up. And it's interesting that we would put plants and animals together. The biblical writer has different characteristics, different categories for each. And so the plants are more like inanimate objects, although I'd rather eat a plant than a piece of dirt, of course. And so, but we've superimposed our own taxonomy on it, kind of like, what the Bible calls Jonah's animal that he got swallowed up by a big fish. And we're saying, well, no, if it's a whale, it can't be a big fish. If it swims in the ocean and it's big, it's a fish. In other words, they're not wrong, by the way. Their categories are different. They have a different set of ways of describing it, and so they don't, if somebody would have said, well, actually a whale doesn't breathe the same way a fish does, it's actually a mammal thing. It's in the water. We're looking at things that are in the water. You got funny qualifications, so the third day is over in 13, and then you get to 14. You think, all right, so what about the animals? No, but by the way, it's almost as this is an aside. This is really this is probably my favorite part of the beginning of Genesis, is this verse 14 and following. God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens. That's on that dome up there, whatever that means. And to separate the day from the night, and let there be signs for seasons and for days and years. Let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. And of course, he's talking about the sun and the moon, and they help understand the seasons and all that. And we'll call the one the big light and the other one the little light, verse 16. And why doesn't he just call them the sun and the moon? Because the sun and the moon were two of the most important divine beings in Mesopotamia. They just got demoted. They just got demoted from very powerful divine beings that are so overwhelmingly important and can't be ignored because, like, they're there all the time. You can't miss them. To now they're important, but they're just props. Inanimate props, and they're simply there to help us understand the seasons and the time of day and night. It's like, wow, that and he made the stars too, which of course we're thinking, well, now we understand the stars are like, the earth and the sun, this solar system is a pretty small percentage of the whole universe. So to have the rest of the universe described in like 3 words seems utterly preposterous, except that the writer's goal is different than our goal. It's describing the fact that, oh, by the way, yeah, it's out there and they're stars. And if I told you the stars are infinite, I think you probably would be so freaked out that you wouldn't be able to get to the next verse for a while, remember, if a Greek wrote this, they'd be philosophizing about every word on every page and they would never get to the creation of humanity, let alone anything else. So God's in complete control of them. Verse 17. These are the sun and the moon were two of the most powerful divine beings. The moon god was the mayoral deity in the city of Ur, where Abraham came from. And so this is not an accidental thing. And the sun god, the Shamash, was a god of a couple of different cities, Sippar and elsewhere. And of course, there's also the god of justice. Now they're just props. They have lots of value, but it's all inanimate value now, and so they've lost that. And so God's in complete control. He's running everything. He's setting everything up the way he wants it. And it's being described in the order that God wants to describe it too. And so for us to get caught up in that, I think, is almost missing the point of the text, which is again, I'm going to keep on saying it, God's control and his order for this. So, and then by the end of 18, God saw that was good. Remember, chapter and verse divisions are artificial. They're really good. I'm glad that they're there. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. And then we finally get in verse 20, little by little, it's also as if we're going up the totem pole of existence. You got your inanimate objects, then you've got your for them inanimate vegetation, which is edible, and then you start getting your animate beings, and you have the three parts. You've got verse 20, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures. Okay, the waters and birds, and so he's filling in the ocean and the sky. Okay, does this mean they were filled in before the land? I don't know. I don't know how that works. And the sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind, and God saw that it was good. That's verse 21. And then God does something that he doesn't do with other things. He blesses them. He gives them a good word. Okay. And because he's now giving them their marching orders, as if they would understand this, because of course, how does an animal know to be fruitful, multiply? It's implanted in its DNA. You don't have to tell an animal to be fruitful, multiply. You be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters of the seas, let the birds multiply in the earth. It's interesting that that's the same thing we're going to hear a little bit later on. It's like, that's, in other words, there's a connection between these animate creatures and the humans later on. It anticipates it in the Hebrew mindset. So day 5 is over. And then it's interesting, day 6 is put together where now we have the creatures on land. And we're just one of those. And it's interesting that this is almost sort of the opposite. It's going from, I don't want to say less important, lower on the totem pole to higher on the totem pole. It should be the other way around. You should start with the top and go to the bottom. And so there's irony here. In the Bible, the biblical writers love irony. They always want to do something that is unexpected. It's always the younger son that, supersedes the older son. In fact, it conditions you to always expect the unexpected thing to happen. And so it's happening here. And so, God's beginning to make the living creatures, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind. And it was so, and then it's repetitive in 25. And by the way, the repetition is there because remember, you're hearing this. And what do you like to hear when you're hearing? You like to hear that repetition. It makes you feel like you're connected to it. And it's better and easier to remember something when you hear that repetition. kind of like music. Now, this is probably not put to music because it's not poetry. This is my guess. And all poetry in the Bible is probably put to music. So we have that repetition 25, and then finally we get to 26. Okay, and you're thinking after all this, what about me? What about me? What about us? Where do we come into all this? So finally, and then you get thrown for a loop. Let us make man in our image. All right, we better stop here for a second. I mean, I'm pause.
Yes.
You have a question about that, maybe before I go on?
Well, I'm sure we'll have to probably do a whole. I mean, we could do a whole episode on that. But yes, it's the first place where it says, "Let us make mankind in our image," and so then the question would be, the obvious questions: who is us?
Yes, who is us? Well, nobody knows for certain. I will give you my best shot.
All right, let's hear it.
I do not believe this is anticipating the Trinity. Okay, I do not believe that God is talking to the triune, God is speaking to himself here. I do not think that's what's going on here. Nothing in the Old Testament negates that, and there are things that perhaps anticipate the fact that when you get to the New Testament, the idea that God can take on human flesh is acceptable, at least in the theory, in theory, that God can be manifest in these different forms. But him having that particular type of nature, that's really hard. Who is he talking to? Well, you wouldn't understand it unless you were an ancient person, but I think that this is God probably speaking to his heavenly court. Okay? And he's including them in this. And I'm going to look at it from my theological and cosmic understanding. It's the same way that if God uses Keagan to be kind to his family or give a cup of water to a person, and it's like, wow, and Keagan did that, and that person really needed the water, and it helped them, or Keagan shared the gospel to somebody at church, and that person became a believer. It's like, wow, Keagan got to do it. Keagan, it's like, well, actually, if Keagan didn't do it, God probably would have figured out another way of getting it done. In other words, God allowed Keagan to participate in his plan. And so here, God has a heavenly court in the heavens. It's alluded to occasionally, but it's never the main point of anything because it's just not. It's not on our radar. Our radar is about what's going on with us on Earth. And so we're not really privy to it. I don't know if you want to call it classified information, but it's like we just get little snippets of the fact that God, like any earthly ruler, because he's a king, he has his heavenly court, he's talking to them. Does he need any help? No, he's probably deliberating with them to allow them to participate in this. And, I'm actually talking about this in another podcast soon, that in Joshua chapter 10, when the sun and earth don't move, and I'm going to talk about this in a Mesopotamian context, the miracle there that we are told was the fact that God listened. It wasn't even the miracle of the sun and the moon. It says this was a day like no other. And you're thinking, why, yeah, the sun stood still. Then it says, because God listened to a man. And basically, Joshua gave him advice, and God said, that's a good idea. I'll do that. And you think about it, like, didn't God know? No, but he allowed Joshua to participate in the event itself, which was really cool, because I think he works that way with us too. And then he can pat us on the back. That was good. You actually helped. And it's kind of like when my granddaughter wants to wash the dishes, I let her, she go in there and she puts the dishes in there and she washes the dishes. And then after she's all done, I said, that was a great job. And what do? I rewash the dishes. But I allowed her to participate in the plan of washing And here, I think it's the same thing. Whoever this is, this us, is probably the plurality of him talking to his heavenly court, and he's giving them his deliberation. In other words, we're being let in on God's mentality about how he's structuring this. This would be a millisecond, but God's deliberating. All right, I've done all this stuff with all these creatures, but I don't have a creature that's like me. And by the way, in his blueprint, he probably had all of this thought out, but when he speaks it, it's like, now I'm going to speak the process itself. It's the last thing I'm going to do today is I'm going to make the human. Let us make the Adam, and that's sort of a funny term. It can be human, male, personal name for a guy. It sounds like the word for blood, and it looks a little like the root for dust. And so it's got all these possibilities moving on that all are connected later on in chapter 2, verse 7. But and then it says, we're going to make him in our image.
Yes. So again, if you guys have questions about this, we will, I'm sure, put in your questions. We'll probably have to do a whole episode on that.
Yes, we should.
So then my question, because I'm semi-familiar with that divine council scene, the pushback is going to be that this is Trinitarian. So just shortly, again, not getting into a full debate, do you have more on that, of that this is the Trinity, right? Like nothing was made without Jesus. Jesus made everything. He was the Word and in the beginning. And then the other possible argument would be, so God's saying here, let us make mankind in our image. Then you go down to 27. So God created mankind in his own image. Again, now going from the plural to the singular, but again, people being like, well, that's Trinitarian language or potential connection of, well, if God makes mankind in his own image, so we are made after God. And in 26, God is saying, let us, again, putting on the Trinitarian cap, let us make mankind in our image. Then they'll just go down to...
I guess my answer is, if you want to do that, that's great. But I'm trying to look at it from the standpoint of a late bronze writer and listener, and they did not have that privy to that information. That's a mystery that is not revealed until Christ. You think about it. Nobody figured it out. In the same way that when Paul talks about the mystery of the fact that Gentiles and Jews actually become a new man, there's a new man called a Gentile Jew in Ephesians 3, and Paul says, when I'm telling you this, you're the first to hear it. Even the angels haven't even been told. In the same way in 1 Corinthians, when Paul says, if the evil powers knew that by killing Christ, if they knew what it meant, they never would have done it. In other words, God was holding this close to his vest and not letting anybody know, even the heavenlies. And so does this anticipate the Trinity? It allows for the existence of the Trinity, but I do not think that's what's explicitly being discussed here. That's my own mindset. And I think that more and more after people have been studying the ancient Near Eastern world, I think they're coming around to looking at it from that standpoint. But it's not necessarily an either or. I mean, obviously, you have God, the Word speaking here. You have God. You have the Spirit being described at some point. But if all I had was Genesis 1, would I have figured out the Trinity? My answer is no. I never would have figured it out. How just with this information and nothing else afterwards, I would not have looked at this and said, oh, God's triune. I never would have guessed. And that's the whole point. Nobody, not one human guessed that until the incarnation. Right. Even then, you think about it, Jesus doesn't just start wandering around, saying, I'm God. And you look at the book of Mark, how do you know Jesus is God by the book of Mark? By reading the whole thing and saying, how does this guy control the heavens and the earth by just raising a hand and stopping it? The only thing who could do that would be, wait a minute, it would be, oh, I guess he's God. In other words, it's a subtle, everything in there is subtle. And the only place it's not subtle is really when you get to the book of John, which is a couple generations later, where it's, all right, now that we've gone through this and you've already read those books, now we understand Christ to be God himself in the flesh. Now let's look at our stories through that lens. That's what John is doing. So I'm getting theological. My head's hurting.
Yeah, no, but so then my follow-up question to that would be, in that same way of not being revealed until later, in the same way that the prophecies in the Old Testament of Jesus and the coming Messiah are misidentified and they have a different understanding of what they presume it to be, and then the actual fulfillment of Christ is kind of that hindsight, yes, that is it, but not how we would have predicted it or not how we thought of it. Can that roll into any of this as well from like your perspective of like we wouldn't have gotten the Trinity from this, but is it possible that in this they would have understood it this other way, but in like a weird sense? No. You know what I mean?
I don't know. I don't even want to go there, because that's...
You can do that with anything then?
Yes, you can do it with anything, and I think it's fun speculation as long as I don't take it seriously, like, all right, I've got to figure this out.
Yeah.
Because, the prophecies of the Old Testament, if you put them all together and said, all right, this is how they're going to be applied in the New Testament, not one person would have figured it out, because they're not applied literally in many cases. And they're also, it doesn't mean that you thought it meant this, but it really meant this. No, it did mean this. In Isaiah chapter 7, when it talks about a maiden who will conceive, it's just a term for maiden. Of course, if you're a maiden, you're also a virgin, and that's why the Septuagint translated as Parthenos, virgin. It's talking about the fact that a girl will give birth before these events are going to happen that we're talking about. And of course, the inspired writer in the New Testament uses that to say, yeah, this is also a prophecy. In other words, it has an immediate historical context. And by the way, if it didn't, what good would it be? Can you imagine? Here you are, you're suffering and in pain, and I'm telling you, someday in a long, long time, long after you're dead, this is all going to pan out. You're thinking, well, that really helps me right now. There's got to be an immediate context to it. So, and people have written scores of things about the immediate fulfillment of prophecy and then a cosmic, a long-term fulfillment. And they don't match up. They certainly don't match up the way we think.
Yeah.
At all. And so I'm going to be humble about it and say, wow, I'm going to get on my knees and say, wow, I never would have figured this out. Yeah. Rather than try to critique it.
Yeah. So for now, we'll say, let us, divine counsel. Isn't that also what they call, in case people are wondering, like the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, right? That'd be like, if you look that up, you'd be able to find stuff.
And by the way, this worldview is the ancient worldview. And so it's not exactly a new concept, where it's sort of resurrecting the old concept. And of course, my colleague, Mike Kaiser, is the one, by the way, he's popularized it, but the academic world would have said, well, there's nothing new here. In other words, and Mike even said it, I'm taking all these scholarly articles and I'm basically breaking it down, superimposing and putting it into an audience in my evangelical way for a believing audience. But the scholarly world, we're not usually very good at public, putting ourselves out in a public way, they were all thinking this way. It's just like, I don't really care. I don't have a dog in the fight. A lot of them, if they're not believers, like, yes, this is how the Israelites believe things. And now Mike Kaiser's saying, well, I'm a Bible believer, so if the Israelites thought this way about this, I need to take it seriously.
And that's probably what you'd say too. Yeah, this isn't nothing that you're saying. This isn't a new view. It is a different way to look.
It's a new view. It's a new view for the evangelical audience, though.
For the listeners.
Yes. And so it is, and it's sort of alarming because of that.
Yep. No, that sounds good. So yeah, let's we'll continue on, and then once we get to we could probably get through this 6th day, and then wrap up and do some questions on that before we move into 2 on the Adam and Eve and more of the creation that we're already seeing in 1.
Well, obviously with the 6th day, you've got the human being. And so this is a big topic. And so let's just see how far we get.
Yeah. Or if you want, we can pause it. And we can.
I think it's a good stopping point. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. So then, I mean, like in summary, I guess my defense is the layperson. I feel too sophisticated in saying layperson, so we got to come up with a better term. But to me, the argument for what you're saying, in my mind, how when I'm in agreement with you, but like when I first learned about it, and again, it was kind of alarming and shocking. I've never looked at it that way. Would be, so you're saying he's creating order, God's creating order. To me, that makes sense. So if you can put that lens on and view it through that lens, it would make sense because you have day 1, 2, 3, 1 matches 4, 2, 5, 3, 6. Because otherwise, the order, again, if the order is talking about actual material objects, to me, it doesn't make sense. So God makes the lights. I'll finish that later. Okay, now I'm going to do this. All right, I'll finish that later. No, like he would have assumed, and maybe not. I could be totally wrong, right? Maybe that's how God did it. He paused his project, moved on to the next one. But to me, it's, so you have time, you have, time, then day 4, I should have these better memorized, right? So you make the lights, then you make the water, so then you have like actual like space, and you have like vegetation and people, right? So now it's all of a sudden, okay, you have the lights, which is day 2, all right? Am I boggling my
day and night are there before the sun and the moon?
Which was my other argument to you. So if it's, because if it's, I'll ask that next. So you have God makes the lights, giving order to it, and then all he does when he connects it down later is he gives more order to it. Okay, so I make the lights, then I make the sea, then I make the land. Now I give more order to it. I create days and months and years and calendars and seasons, bringing more order to that same thing. And then I'm going to separate, right? And I'm going to fill it with creatures, and I'm going to bring vegetation. So all it is he's taking that very same thing and then bringing more order to it. And that's that 2, 4. I'm not going to do that again because now I got numbers bouncing around. But you know what I mean? It's just more and more order.
And the sun, moon, and stars are completely subordinate to all this, and they're even subordinate to the order of the seasons. And of course, we know that without the sun and the moon, we couldn't have our seasons. But that's not the point here. The point is the priority of God's order, and he's subordinating these inanimate objects because everyone knows what they meant. And of course, in Mesopotamia, they are obsessed with astronomical phenomena, celestial phenomena, just absolutely, their divination was obsessed by it, or they were obsessed by it. And so this is basically putting a wrench in the spokes, or, something. So you can't think that way anymore. These objects are subordinated, not just to me, but even the rest of the created order. They're not as important as you thought they were. So this is, and so they might even be described in order of importance, or maybe it's descending importance. There's a lot of things going on here that we don't think that way. So yeah, it can't be true because we don't think that way.
Yeah, and to semi-correct myself, but to go off of that, yeah. So you had water, then what the creatures in the water, then but again, it wouldn't follow the natural progression that we would think, which is okay. We'll lump them in with the other animals, create all the animals, but it's not, because you have the time element, more lights, then you have the water element. Okay, well then it follows suit. Water animals, then you have land and vegetation, follow suit. Humankind, livestock, and all that stuff. To me, it just, if you can take off what you thought before and read it from how they would have understood it, that it's God creating order. To me, it's all of a sudden like, it opened my eyes to it, but also to me, it makes so much more sense. It's literally what it's saying.
Be serious. Vegetation and all that is there before the sun and the moon. How does that work? Okay.
Well, my favorite was So it was
That should squash the chronological right there.
well, yeah, and like the lights, right? So God makes the lights. Again, doesn't finish the project. Later on, he makes the sun and the moon. But there was morning and there was day. Well, he hadn't made day yet in 2, right? He doesn't make it until 5.
So if you're obsessed with the idea of a 24-hour span, you've got to work through all these things, and you basically have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to try to figure all this out. And my answer is less. We don't have to worry about it if we look at it from the ancient Near Eastern mindset that they're just not thinking the way that we're thinking about this as order and function. So it doesn't mean that God doesn't have a chronological setup. It's just not. It's not the purpose here, and because of that, it's not wrong.
Right? Like it could be
Yeah.
very well could be. It's just
Yes.
that's not the point. Like it's not. It's almost very well could be, but they're not answering that question.
That'd be like saying the book of Mark is not giving Jesus life in the right order, so he's wrong. And the answer is, well, if that wasn't his purpose, why are you evaluating him on something that wasn't his intention?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate this episode, and I mean a lot of interesting stuff that I feel like we've gone through individually through Genesis before, but even me sitting here learning new things. And another scholar who's now famous in this kind of world and reading ancient texts has said, like, it seems very apologetic as well against these other religions.
Yeah, and my answer is I think it's a subtle apologetic. I don't think it's the primary goal, but it's in their back of their mind. This is how these people have been thinking. So, and I understand where they're coming from. And so here it is. And once in a while, there's a dig. And I think that in verse 2, there's a dig on the creation, the Mesopotamian creation epic with Tiamat, with Tehom. And there's occasionally a dig in verse, 15 and 16 about the great lights. And they're not even given their name. They're just called the objects. It's like me going outside. Hey, where's that large yellow cylindrical object I normally see? And you're thinking, hey, buddy, did you just arrive on this planet? We call it the sun here. Oh, yeah, that thing. And so, in other words, I demoted it by not even giving it the benefit of its name. And then you get to the human. The human is the last thing made. You would think the last thing made would be the most unimportant item.
Yeah.
And it sure looks that way when you get to 2, when we're dust creatures.
Well, there you go. Way to tease the next episode. So we'll talk all that. See how many episodes that takes us.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, that was great. Thank you all for tuning in. As always, if you guys have questions and you want to interact, we'll attach some stuff below for you to be able to ask questions, have access to Mark so that, we can make an episode based on your questions so that he can answer maybe any frustrations or questions or wrestling that you guys are having. We want this to be more than just us talking. We want to be collaborative with you, the audience, the listeners. So if you have any questions, drop them below. Otherwise, we'll see you next time for the creation of mankind.
Because it's really mentally exhausting having to answer all of Keagan's questions and nobody else's. It's tough. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Well, most of mine are over text or a phone call. So
it's the best, but I just had to say that.
All right. Awesome. We'll see you next time.